Coming up on Good Journeys with Ben Veal.
I was communicating with some of the custodians of the COVID memorial wall, which I've done all the way through. And at first I thought, well, what is this? Where's this come from? I'm always a little bit worried about, is this authentic? Who's doing this? Was this a stunt? And then they maintained it. And I wonder if without that wall, we'd have even more ways to forget. Because that's such an important thing after disaster for leaders and for economies and for societies to go, it wasn't really that bad. And we saw the profound effect of something like that, of the Vietnam War. Let's try and pretend it didn't happen. And look what that does to mental health. For me, I've always been kind of, okay, why aren't we taking stock? And I do sort of poke there.
Welcome to Good Journeys with Ben Veal, the show that explores the trails traveled and lessons learned from some truly incredible people.
How do you cope in a crisis? What does it really mean to plan for the unimaginable? How do we begin to rebuild when everything has changed? And what's it like to carry the weight of other people's grief while still finding space for our own? These are the kinds of questions that today's guest, Professor Lucy Easthope, has been asking and answering throughout her extraordinary career. Lucy is the UK's leading authority on disaster recovery and emergency planning. When the world shifts suddenly, whether through natural disasters, terrorist attacks or global crises, she's one of the first people called to help communities, governments and families navigate the hardest moments of their lives. In her beautiful and deeply moving new book, Come What May, Lucy shares the human stories behind disaster recovery, the quiet, complex and compassionate work that so often goes unseen. It's a book about loss, about resilience, and about what it really means to stand alongside people when everything they know has fallen away. Lucy, I'm so grateful you're here with me today. Welcome to Good Journeys.
Thank you very much for having me.
How are you today?
I'm very good, thank you. How are you?
I'm really well. And as we said off air before we started recording, I've been reading this wonderful book for the last few weeks, Come What May, and it has really been helpful. As I said to you, my local community has, my friends have gone through the loss of a loved one recently, and actually reading your book and kind of contextualizing it into what so many of us go through and the different stages that come both preparing for and dealing with disasters and unexpected crises, I found hugely, hugely helpful. What made you want to write this book?
Oh, that means everything to me. Thank you. And it is genuinely from a desire to help, which actually can be quite terrifying when you're writing, because you suddenly, I think particularly with the social media that I engage with, you think, oh, am I going to be considered patronizing? So I really had to lean in. I particularly found anything which is weird because in my work I'm quite directional, but when I was writing directions and try this, I was thinking, oh, what if somebody says, who are you to say that? But it genuinely came from within. And the sort of form and structure of it came from the questions that I got when I put out When the Dust Settles, which is a memoir about the work in emergency management. And you go to all these book events and you're supposed to sort of talk about the book, and the authors before and after me would get questions about the writing process. And I would just get 40 minutes of how do you cope with crisis. And eventually I started to write it down, and the themes that people were interested were very clear. And also that space allowed me to gently challenge. So you will know from the book, and I'm sure we'll talk about them, there's perhaps some unusual or different ways that people may be quite surprised by, a little bit even, challenge ideas of bad help. So these lovely, often, things like book festivals are held in tents with lots of cake. And it was this very safe space to say, oh, do you think that might not be helpful? And then I thought, I've got to write this down. It was a difficult book. It came from a place of my own bereavement. So Dad died in April 2023. And there was this very strong sense of, oh, right, now a life of working with other people in crisis, that's come home. What are you going to do with that now? So that became a theme within the book. And the other great thing about writing this down, which I didn't realize meant so much to me until both books existed, is then they are there. And one of the great things I'm finding is just seeing how people use and have them and pick them up when they want to. Books are very interesting for that, aren't they? It's not the same as somebody sort of bombarding you down a phone call with advice. They're just there. You can gift them. And that has been the most unexpected pleasure of becoming an accidental author.
I think, yeah, I mean, as I say, I mean, this book is already full of, it's got lots of turned down pages, as you can see there.
I love that.
I've been kind of WhatsApping people little sections of the book and saying, listen to this bit. But because actually this book is, it's surprisingly in points. There's some actually really good humour in there. There's a lot of vulnerability. As you say, it does kind of, it's an instruction manual to a degree. It's also a memoir. It's also got really accessible tips, but then it's also layered with all these beautiful stories of communities that you've encountered and people that you've met along the way who've gone through huge tragedies, but yet have found their own way to cope. I was interested by, obviously, you mentioned there about your dad, and you and I have exchanged a few messages because we lost our dads very similar times. So yours passed away in April 2023. Mine was in June of that year, and you know, it's very clear in your book that losing your dad has left a really big hole in your life. And I think you've done a really beautiful job of paying tribute to him. And I came away with a bit of a real sense of the man he was and how he treated others. And that's kind of the same with me. That's how I felt with my dad and how I've tried to pay tribute to his life since. I think something that's not talked about anywhere near enough in our society is kind of what the recently bereaved have to deal with when they lose a loved one. And you've described this brilliantly as sad men. I don't know if that's your term or if...
It's definitely borrowed from the death world, yeah.
But, you know, I hadn't heard that term before, and I love it because as an executor afterwards, I was so overwhelmed by all of these kind of dispassionate letters from all these companies and all the forms you have to fill out, just everything you have to do when what you really should be doing is just sitting quietly with your grief.
Yeah.
How was that experience for you?
And it was a word that I'd actually seen for a long time. I'm a very proud professor at the Centre for Death and Society at the University of Bath. And often the great thing about a centre like that is the scholars will unpick the pain that comes with these kind of processes. So sadmin had sort of started to come into the lexicon. And I think it had become particularly mainstream with the use by Reverend Richard Coles in his book on grief and grieving. And exactly as you say, the toll of it, the emotional labour of it. And also that every time you know, a letter comes in that feels so callous, it feels so personally wounding and so thoughtless. And I have to say, it had sort of come into my life very early. I spent a lot of time, as I say in both books, with the parents and the children and the siblings of people bereaved in the disasters of the 1980s and 1990s in a collective group that was called Disaster Action. And one of the ways they partially took the sting out of the tale personally was they would share the letters that they'd received from organisations. You know, dear Mr. Jones brackets deceased. Mm-hmm. These kind of behaviours, and the wounds just kept coming. You know, there would be things from academics and psychologists saying, "We hear you've been recently bereaved in an incident. Please, will you come and tell us your trauma narrative at an event?" You know, the harms, the arrows kept flying. And so very early on in my career, I really took on this need for thoughtfulness in your administration. And it's been behind closed doors, people like banks and others have made huge steps the last few years. But it's not just when they get it right. Even if they get it right, it's still a profound amount of labour for you and the other executors. And there's just so much of it. And I do think one of the big innovations was the Tell Us Once scheme, which is something you do at death registration, sort of triggers that a number of organisations and particularly parts of local and central government are informed. That's been a big change in my lifetime, but it's still a lot of work. One of the things I don't know if you've sort of spotted this as well. It was particularly a phenomenon I found on X was just the way perhaps the algorithm works. When mum lost dad, and we all lost dad, but mum became a widow, a terrible term in a way. She really, really doesn't like it. What we noticed was there were lots of other people going through exactly the same thing, and they would keep each other going. If they managed to get through to the phone company and get the account closed, everyone would be like, "Oh, you deserve a cup of tea and a piece of cake," and they'd cheer us through the admin. And although mum didn't have her own account, she'd sort of cheer along, and that what I've realized is alongside the admin, there's a lot of support needed to just keep you going. Well done, another piece of admin done. And it doesn't stop. I don't think in the lives of the bereaved, it's still coming our way. It's less voluminous, but it's still coming. And there's still moments. One of the things I've definitely learned alongside bereavement, or proxy bereavement, all my life is the wounds just keep going, and the paperwork keeps coming.
Yeah, and I mean, you have more than experienced your fair share of proxy bereavement. I mean, you've been doing this for decades now, the work that you've been doing. I mean, where does this journey begin to you, and how begin for you, and how do you fall into a life of doing what you do, Lucy? Because it's a pretty incredible career that you've carved out.
And you do a lot of sense making at this end of the life, and you don't know whether it would, it didn't make sense to a lot of people to be very interested in it. So one thing I've talked about, is the profound effect on me of having classmates, and my mum and dad were teachers and had class members at the Hillsborough football match, 15th of April 1989, and that really galvanized me to want to work in this field, which is a really strange thing to take to a careers advisor in your teens. So they recommended law. And I went to study law with the ambition to work in disaster response. And I think initially probably in kind of policy, I knew I didn't have what it perhaps took to be a first responder. And then my first job was working for a private disaster management firm, just relentlessly really on what we call mass fatality incidents. And then when I left there, Britain was really gearing up to think about things like how they would help the bereaved and survivors after incidents. And that's just been my life ever since. And I think one of the things that when Dad died, I realized was it did hit me that not only had it been a different life to a lot of people have experienced, but also a different set of helps and coping strategies. And, my auntie was listening to some radio I did at the weekend, and she asked me quite a lot about, things that she hadn't known about my career and my life. And I think the books have given me the chance to say, okay, there's difference here. And that is really important as well to acknowledge. One of the big things for me was the fact that I've always prioritized looking after my brain and my mental well-being before it became too much. Of course, I've experienced very low mood. Of course, I've experienced burnout. But by always seeing this as something that could happen, I've accessed a lot of debriefing and other techniques. And when I was starting to talk about these at the book events, I realized that this was a true luxury. It was a luxury I'd paid for myself, but it was a true luxury, and perhaps had done something different to my development, if you like, than lots of other people. And just the access to talking therapies, for example, and that I really wanted to destigmatize. And not a lot of people are now seeking help for mental health, but probably at a very late stage. And so I think I was quite an interesting case study for somebody who'd always said, I will prioritize my personal well-being here.
Yeah, and I mean, you talk about it in the book, like you're very open about some of those coping strategies, and they might be quite unexpected for someone in your field. So things like kitchen discos, which is a huge thing for our neurospicy household. If it all gets a bit much, then we have a kitchen disco.
Stick the music on, yeah.
Absolutely. Tell me about some of the things that actually kind of keep you present and grounded whilst you're doing this, incredibly challenging work.
Yeah, so it's this real spectrum. And I love that a lot of the current discussion has been around the love of the music, the love of the planthams. I've just opened Desert Island Discs with Eminem because Lose Yourself goes into my body, and then I know I'm going into a new world. We also, as I'm sure you do in your household, use it as a diffuser, coming into home. Last night there was a call into a major incident, and it's very difficult sometimes more and more now that when you work from home to be able to separate the two worlds, and sort of taking yourself out and then coming back in can be very, very challenging. So I like to go away to the incident or to the the sort of command center or something, and then come back and use that journey. I talk about in the book using things like an internal monologue quite a lot. I'm always surprised at people when they don't talk to themselves. I'm always like, who do you talk to? And quite often people will see me in the street and they're like, are you listening? Have you got like an ear pod in or something? I don't know. No, I'm just chatting to myself.
Do they then cross the street? Yeah.
And I've always chatted. I've always stimmed. Lots of over the years, because you have to learn how important you being in control of, and I'm not in control of my body, but partially in control of your body is in these situations, because you don't want to say that, these are the people at the worst time of their lives. It's very much not about you. You want to be looking like you're quite sedate and in control. But I move a lot. I stim. I will leap if there's something quite interesting. And I get a lot of overwhelm and I think it takes a long time in a household to learn your language of near burnout. Yeah. I think a lot of relationships founder and flounder because people think that the other person is shutting them out, or, if they say, I need to go and be somewhere else, or I need to go and lie down, it's a huge insult to that person. One thing I just don't think we teach at all, and I've tried to start to do more at home, is the literacy in particularly teenagers of how to say, this is what I think I need, it's not about you. And also maybe putting in a little bit of that sometimes it's not all about them. You can live in a household where everybody's trying to assert their own need for emotional well-being, and actually the person who needs it most is sort of drowning in the middle. So there's a lot of communication that needs to go on. I was very honest. I wasn't honest to begin with. I did a couple of events and radio things at the start of When the Dust Settles, and they said, how do you cope with your work and things? And I said things which is absolutely true, that, it was a great privilege. And then one time my husband shouted at the radio, because actually it does take a lot of work to keep me going. I have very regular debriefing with a very, very experienced trauma psychologist. And very rarely is that about something that I've seen. It's generally about perhaps how I've felt I haven't been able to do more. So that big sort of, kind of messiah complex that can develop in disaster management. It helps you to parcel up why people might be so angry. It allows you to go there with that inner voice to places that, for example, with bereavement, people can often feel a great sense of relief. If there was a complexity in the family situation before the loss. I give a big shout out in the book to agony ants, because I think they often in their columns give so much permission, don't they, for the other types of feelings.
That used to be my favourite page to read in the newspaper. Go straight to the agony ant section.
And I used to write to Dr. Miriam. So I think I wrote to about 4 times in the Daily Mirror as a teen. I love the way that they give permission, and I hope that that's what Come What May is, a big load of permission, particularly in chapters like Needful Things. You have the right to feel naughty things. You have the right to need intimacy in the middle of a crisis, the widow's fire or whatever kind of fire you need. I was very, very pleased to read Lucy Pollock's books as I was writing this, who kind of really allows you in hospices and hospitals to be able to have the things that you need, rather than what society says, both end of life and bereavement and divorce and redundancy. The amount of toxic positivity, the amount of gratitude forced on people, that comparison we do. At least they didn't suffer, at least they got to do this. The big thing with the loss of Dad, I don't know if you found this, was I did slightly buy into the good life thing, good innings thing. He was too young, he was 72, but I did sort of buy into the fact maybe it would hurt less if you lost your dad than it would if they were younger. But actually it's just this great big hole, and I'm totally comfortable now with the fact that there's no toxic positivity to cheer us up on that.
Isn't that crazy? My dad was 72 as well when he passed.
Oh, that's wonderful. That's too bloody young. They just needed a few years.
It is. And as you say, I mean, you're right there. I mean, there was a lot of complexity in our relationship. We often didn't understand one another. A lot of the grieving process when you lose someone, I think, is also you're grieving the fact that you'll never get to actually have that conversation. That was a big part of me. I was grieving the fact that I never got to actually really tell my dad, apart from on his deathbed, I never really got to tell my dad what he meant to me. And I never got to have a two-way conversation with him about that, really, about our relationship. And so a lot of the grieving process is you're grieving the lost opportunity as much as you're grieving the person.
I think especially in my work, when I see so many interrupted goodbyes, and it's all that you're in these family assistance centres waiting for news, and people are very much like, well, it can't be dead because we left on a row. And it perhaps added a certain artificiality into how I am as a wife and how I parent, and also perhaps my relationship with dad, because I overtell, like everybody knows I love them when I leave the house. And I'm very strict that it isn't that last text message that goes, well, screw you then, but I think that was because there's this strange proportion in disaster response of people thinking, oh gosh, I can't believe those were my last words. But I have wondered whether that's also linked to the just the terrible ways that we beat ourselves up anyway, Yeah. And that's where I do find, as I say in the book, people like the wonderful Annalisa Barbieri, the people that give you permission for all the feels and all the feelings. And that was so, there's certain chapters where I thought, gosh, am I being too cheeky here? But Needful Things is one where I'm just giving you permission for whatever you feel and why.
Well, the thing is, I mean, I'll flash it up once more here on the screen, give it another plug. But this is a real, you're living it's very heavy what you do. I don't think there's any other way of saying it. You're in a heavy space dealing with heavy emotions, and this could be a very heavy book, but actually it's quite a light read, surprisingly. I came away from it feeling calm and also inspired, and very inspired by some of the stories. I mean, you talk a lot about the Grenfell disaster, which is obviously one of the biggest and avoidable tragedies of recent times. Yet in the face of such huge loss, there's some incredible stories have emerged within that community. I mean, tell me about what you've seen there firsthand.
And there's a danger that the stories get lost, but also the work that gets lost, and the public get to see this very brief plays to a certain amount of stereotypes kind of view of things, and then when you go back and forth to a response, you get to see how hard people are working, how hard they're putting in, and also the writing about Grenfell is a particular theme in the chapter on survivance, which is about coming back. This wonderful term from Indigenous Americans. It's not about coming back and recovering to a government script. It's about courage and defiance, rebellious emotions, and a lot of that gets kind of sandpapered out of the official story. And I don't think people always realize how much compliance is expected sometimes from communities. You will need to look sad here, you will need to do this here, and it's very comparable to our own experiences with crisis. People will sort of dictate how you're supposed to be. The number of times in either disaster or something like a maternity scandal, I get told there's some difficult mothers. You're not supposed to be a rebel in these situations. And I came to find this wonderful charity, the Latimer Community Art Therapy Charity, at the base of the Grenfell Tower. And it's been supporting children with both what seems to be a very successful form of art therapy, but also you can't do that sort of therapy on an empty stomach or without a chance to play or a chance to do sport. So it combines the two. And it was a really rebellious act to found it by a group of women, and they just deserve their place in the story. And sometimes, there's this sort of official need for how things should be organised. I suppose it comes back to the Sadmin point, and then what's really going on. And that's been a big part of my disaster experience. And I think that's really, really, really interesting for people to understand. And I just loved the chance, as you get with publishing and writing, to bring these women to the fore, and they are my hope. And then the other thing that keeps me going is children in disaster. They don't respond in the way that people think they're going to do necessarily. You used the word before, heavy, and I think a lot of the kind of modern pathways of what they expect children to feel are very heavy, all about their trauma and all about their distress. And actually the children are very funny and very angry and very, they are the ones that ask the difficult questions. Children are not future adults. I make that very, very point in my book. They're not waiting to be 18 to have views on the fire, and so they are amazing. And you get things like the first time you give them cardboard boxes and toys again, you get them out the cupboard, they'll build a disaster assistance centre, and those were the stories that deserve to be told in all of this. And so it was just it was a chance, and there's one big shout out to the wonderful Stanley, who was he was sort of a toddler really at the time of the fire, and he's now in high school, and you just go, and his face is always smiling, and he's so cheeky, and he just keeps you going, and he gives you a purpose, because often with something as miserable and violently kind of state inflicted as Grenfell, it's hard to find where there are positives. So I'm so grateful to them, and I just wanted them to know that really in the book.
Yeah, I'm sure they do. And obviously, I'm fascinated by journeys. That's the whole point of this show. One thing I've learned from speaking to so many fascinating people over the years is that every journey goes in many, many different unexpected directions, and it's all about what you kind of learn along the way. And you speak in the book about this importance of looking backwards to move forwards, and you're particularly referencing this COVID memorial wall that sprung up very organically. I think a lot of us are still pretty shell-shocked by the pandemic and haven't really come to terms with it. Like, there was all this kind of, we're past it now, new normal, build back stronger, all these kind of wonderful narratives that went around. But in reality, I think we're 3 years on really from a world that's technically been unlocked. And I think lots of us are still feeling pretty lost and quite unsafe really. Do you have any advice for people who are kind of trying to make sense of this huge unexpected experience that we all went together? Because we are really all kind of disaster survivors, really, aren't we, on the other side of the pandemic?
All disaster survivors now. And there was about a year when I'd read that line out from the first book, and people would react quite strongly, quite negatively. They try and frame that their lockdown was relatively okay. We did a lot of that British toxic positivity, and we said, well, that bad thing wasn't happening to me. I didn't lose anybody immediately. People have started to lose people now. What we always knew with a pandemic was you would have an acute phase with a high death toll, but you'd also just see continuous bereavement and grief for many years afterwards. And so one of the things that I think is really important is chapter 2, this idea of taking stock, saying what this is. And one of the things, when I was in my 20s and 30s, if I said what the thing was, I was like taking up time. Why are you dwelling, Lucy? We've only got an hour for the meeting. And now I'm being allowed, because I'm sort of older and written the books, so I say, tell me why do we brush past it? The number of meetings that I sit in with responders and healthcare, and they say things like, we're not talking about COVID anymore. We're not talking about that again. We don't want to see that in any reports. Wow. And we wondered why 1918 found it so hard to memorialize the Great Flu pandemic. What on earth are we doing? We have been through this incredibly profound event. And I honestly, I was communicating with some of the custodians of the COVID memorial wall, which I've done all the way through. And at first I thought, well, what is this? Where's this come from? I'm always a little bit worried about, is this authentic? Who's doing this? Was this a stunt? And then they maintained it. And, I talk about the labor of it. Again, that word labor. I talk about how much work it is in the book. And I wonder if without that wall, we'd have even more ways to forget, because that's such an important thing after disaster for leaders and for economies and for societies to go, it wasn't really that bad. And we saw the profound effect of something like that of the Vietnam War. Let's try and pretend it didn't happen. And look what that does to mental health of both the countries, where the conflicts occurred, and of course the American veterans. So for me, I've always been kind of, okay, why aren't we taking stock? And I do sort of poke there. Somebody had in my life had surgery recently, and they were sort of talking about the whole year and removing that event. And I think that's a very common experience that we go through. We take out the thing that hurts the most. And so I think the idea of the taking stock, and then what I say, and the number of health columns and health journalists who've come back to me on this is really interesting. Then I say you do an impact assessment and you talk about what this has done. And very early on for something like, I talk a lot in my books about the journey to have both daughters. So pregnancy loss, what is this doing and what has it done to us? And then that helps you make decisions about what you might need to do next. And that leads you all the way through. We're on our journey to chapter 10. And it's things like, actually, does this taking stock lead me to my great epiphany, which is perhaps something isn't working. Often we see people change either job roles, sometimes it's relationships, which is very difficult. But the first port of call is to say what this was.
Yeah. And I think a lot of us are still trying to wrap our head around that. One thing I really want to talk about, because I found this so helpful, I think it'd be helpful to a lot of people listening today, is this idea of the slump. So you've talked about, obviously, the different stages in disaster and what comes after disaster. But I found the slump particularly fascinating as a stage we all have to go through. You'll explain it better than me. What is the slump, Lucy?
Yeah. So again, this was one of those things where it felt like in the disaster recovery world, everybody was looking in, feeling sorry for us, and we were actually having a very good and useful time. And one of the things that we had was this whole set of tools that was just not being used by the rest of the world. And when I started to take this out into the world, it was so helpful. And we worked to a slightly different calendar and graph to everybody else. So before the disaster, can sound quite weird, a quite sort of eerie stage, but you have the incubation phase, maybe a period of illness. But before the big event, something's happening. You then have the event. And then what you see is the honeymoon phase. And that can be quite an intense period of getting ready for something. The funerals might take place during that time, and the love is coming at you. You feel bonded. Oxytocin is flowing. It feels good. And that had become quite, if I'm honest, I think quite weaponized sometimes by governments around the world, not just here. The I Heart, and then the place name, the vigils, and the families and the affected people really feel like people love us. They've got us, their arms around us. And then almost, you can't quite set your clock by it, but you could almost set your clock 8 to 12 weeks, massive slump. People don't seem interested anymore. Tensions are fraying, fragmentation within families. Everything comes to a fore. People say something they don't mean. And then you're just into this viscous time. It interplays slightly with other kind of discussions of bereavement, but it's not just about bereavement. And it's really interesting because that's the part of and we've got a diagram in there, honeymoon into slump. That's the part of the book that most people are probably corresponding to me about. And then people say, okay, how useful is it to know that that's a thing? There's a few things you can do that. One is, even if you're in the honeymoon stage of crisis, you can know it's coming. So maybe you can build your own readiness a little bit. If you know that help does sometimes wane, then you don't come to rely on it too much. That can be quite useful information. And then if you know you're in the slump itself, you can depersonalize it. A lot of people will say to me, why is this, particularly, for example, you got a big flood, and then the community groups start to turn on each other. They'll say, what did we do wrong? Elected local MPs will say, what did you do wrong to lose the honeymoon phase? You must have done something. So it depersonalizes it, because I've probably responded now to 150 disasters of various scales, small and big. And I've studied and reviewed over 2,000. You don't get to game yourself out. The slump is inevitable. And one of the things, for recent instance, since I've been talking more about the slump, that people have said to me is, okay, what can we do to not go into the slump? And that's not possible. And you can apply this, particularly, I think, the chapter 1, you can apply this to things like your own experience with illness, with cancer, with redundancy. You need to know the slump is coming. And there's just, one of the things I'm very grateful for is so much commentary now on how to get yourselves through. And the wonderful breast cancer campaigner and survivor, Dr. Liz O'Riordan, did an amazing podcast the other day about why good news can still feel bad. So you've kind of geared yourself for more bad news, and actually the doctors tell you a little bit more good news, and you weren't expecting it, and you go home as drained as if it was bad news. And that's the sort of thing that I would take to my therapist, and they would be like, it's still producing the same chemicals in your body. You still went into that meeting with the same amount of adrenaline. So sometimes understanding a lot of what I've noticed with the widows community is they're often asking sense-making questions about, why do I still feel like this? So people put a lot of store, for example, by anniversaries, because like that's just a gift card concept. That's not, you don't have to feel better the day after an anniversary. So people say, "Oh, be better after her birthday." You don't have to feel like that. The other thing I'm a big fan of is the idea that the body holds the score. So I think in the slump, you're processing a lot of what you've been through. And then the other thing about the slump is you don't get pulled out of it by anybody else. There is an awful lot of work. You have to kind of go, today I'm putting my coat on to go to the supermarket. Today I will do something different. And the first time I think you may be sort of battling this with your very recent painful bereavement, is the first time you laugh really authentically from the belly. You think, oh, that's the first time I've laughed. And that's those little moments that I've come to really, really, really know. And I think you must be feeling this as well, both with your recent bereavement and with your dad, the moments that hit you when you think, oh, I'd have loved to show him that. Oh, yep. God, I'd have loved that. And my God, that takes your knees, doesn't it? Like I'm rendered without core. I just fall to the floor.
Yeah, I dedicated my first book that came out recently. I dedicated it to my dad because he always wanted to write a book, and I wish the first person I'd have given a copy of this book to would have been him. But also with my friend who passed away recently, Stu, I've got a little caricature of him behind me. So
oh, it's lovely.
Carrying on in the podcast, but Stu was full of laughter. He was always a very, very fun person to be around. Very curious, very similar to you in terms of wanting to know everything about the world, but always full of laughter. And we had some lovely moments in the hospice. Most of the moments I had with him in the hospice were full of laughter. We had lovely moments in his last few days where there were groups of us sitting around his bed, all laughing and sharing stories. And at times you're thinking, oh, is this a bit wrong? But then you're like, no, because this is actually how he lived his life. And actually, this is how I think most of us would want to go, is surrounded by laughter. His funeral service was full of, there was tears, but there was a lot of laughter. And we have this kind of strange, almost like Victorian view of mourning still, don't we? That you have to wear the black band, and you spend a year being miserable, and you feel like you're paying someone a grave disservice if you are enjoying your life.
Yeah.
And it's crazy because death is the one thing none of us can avoid. None of us know how many days we've got in this world, and you have to try and carve out those pockets of joy.
There was this moment at Dad's funeral. We had it in the wake, the party. We insisted on calling it the party was at our house. And we had both caterers, and then all his wonderful cousins and aunties had brought cake. So there was this turf war between the hired caterers and then the table of cake. And there was just so much food, so much laughter. Somebody started to take photos of each other. So many people turned out. Yeah. They hadn't seen each other and they were taking photos. And then I just looked out, and all the little kids were just running, playing tag, and somebody said, that's what he would have wanted, was that this didn't feel like a funeral, it felt like a party. Having said all that, as you and I know, the work comes afterwards. You can keep that momentum going of the fun, and this is what he would have wanted, and then all of a sudden I do believe that grief still has to be done. And one of the things that I'm seeing more and more sometimes with disaster interventions here in the UK is we're desperately trying to keep the families and the bereaved and the survivors busy. And sometimes, like, one of the big things was the hardest things in the first couple of months after Dad died was leaving Mum on her own. And there was quite a campaign to not leave, like, who's taking Mum out today? And eventually I said to my sister, Mum, nobody's doing today, because eventually the work of grief, I think that is universal. It's when going back to Grenfell, when Grenfell happened, there was this is a personal view, there was an overstatement that the disaster recovery of England, the disaster recoverers, we wouldn't understand Grenfell because we weren't Muslim. There was a huge pressure put on us by central government that this wasn't a universal incident. There wasn't shared tenets because there was such a strong faith element. People wouldn't have these shared ideas of what pain is. And what Grenfell's taught me is, of course, there are specificities and of course there are faith needs and faith differences, but there are universal tenets, and the work of grief, regardless of creed or faith, is so hard and has to be done. You can't fill somebody's year with events and vigils and trips and other things. Eventually they have to do a day on their own where they howl at the moon, and you may be still howling at the moon for your losses. I certainly am. And I find that there's a huge time limit put on you by other people. That, you know, people keep saying, oh, it's been 2 years. What's that? That's nothing, you know. And the baby grief, you know, Tom and I lost 5 babies in early pregnancy, but that what was interesting there was you then kind of had other babies alongside, you know, the other babies were born, so you're very busy with it. Dad's loss has been quite just very, very present, and I think brought new insights with it. And just, you know, I hope anybody listening to this who's grieving, the work is needed, but go very gently with yourself, nourish yourself. The value of the cup of tea, I think, sings from both books. And I'm with you. I really understand how hard this slump is.
Cup of tea and cake.
Always cake.
Always cake. Well, look, last thing is, I guess, there's so many takeaways from this book, and I've taken away a lot from it. But, you know, the kind of subheading is life-changing lessons for coping with crisis. Are there any kind of... You cover so much in the book, Lucy, so this is a big question, but are there any kind of overarching lessons that you hope readers will take away from reading this book?
Genuinely, you get a lot of, well, I get a lot of personal grief with the affirmations on my bathroom wall, but I genuinely am a live, love, laugh girl. I think people, and that's, you know, there's a real sense in a post or ongoing disaster community, which we are, there's a real sense of no joy. I talk about hedonic adaptation in the book. There's no reasons to be cheerful. Life is a slog. We're all biological robots. It is labor, I keep using that word, but it's work and labor to find joy. Yeah. And that has to be genuine joy. And also, it doesn't have to be anybody else's joy. You know, my joy can be, I binge watched Mobland yesterday with a packet of Club Orange biscuits. It's whatever you need to do to feel something. And we are, in order to get through, and this is something I've seen more in my career than probably anybody else, in order to get through, you shut down. Because you've learned in the pandemic and in other losses and in other turbulent times and in austerity that if you dare to feel, if you dare to plan, if you dare to dream, it might go horribly wrong. And it sounds to me like you live in a very similar way. Life is a great delight that needs to be explored and adventured, and don't stay fixed in this view that it is so heavy. I'm really, when I see social media posts like how miserable and how heavy Britain is, don't give in to that. And genuinely live life for today. Maybe still have an ISA and make some plans and don't just say everything to your boss you've always wanted to say. But when you've seen as many interrupted goodbyes as I have, today is truly precious. And then the last one, I've taken far too many there. If you do love somebody, tell them today, and then tell them again. Like you just keep telling them, because I don't think we say I love you enough, which does get me into all sorts of trouble and injunctions. But I don't think we say it enough, and I don't think we say thank you enough.
Yeah. Well, look, thank you for writing such a beautiful book. And thank you for this lovely conversation today. Where can people pick up a copy, and how can they connect with you on?
Yeah, so book available everywhere. I obviously I'm a big support your indie good bookshop girl. So please, big shout out to the indie book suppliers who've got me through the last few years. And yeah, please do connect. I'm on X and Blue Sky as at Lucy Gobag. I tweet and post and blue prolifically. So follow me, and then very your phone in the garden, and I'm on Insta at When the Dust Settles Lucy. And I do love to connect with people, so please do that.
Well, I'm so glad we have connected. Thank you for this lovely conversation today.
My great pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Before I wrap up, I always say a couple of thanks. As Lucy says, saying thank you is the most important thing you can do. So firstly, thank you to my producer, Jeff Easton from Tall Lake Productions, who always brings these Good Journeys conversations to life. And secondly, to my wonderful audience for joining these purposeful chats. But the biggest thanks of all goes to you, Lucy Easthope. Your new book, Come What May, is out now. And I can't recommend this book highly enough. It's helped me to make sense of some very difficult times recently, and I hope it can do the same for all of you out there. That's it for today. This has been another purposeful conversation. It's been Good Journeys with Ben Veal. Keep on climbing, be good to each other, and I'll see you all again soon. Bye.